How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
Just a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Ben. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare.
I'm just going to go ahead and hit record so we can get all of Todd's bullshit out of the way early. Todd is not a Tobe Hooper fan. We know this
Buckle
now.
in, Todd. We got several weeks to go. We're going to be spending a good chunk of 2021 in the world of Tobe Hooper. So. What is that? Are you doing like the David Letterman?
Pulling his collar, yeah.
The David Letterman thing?
He was doing David Letterman. So on this week's episode of the Cinema Shockers, something from the Meat Case, Linda.
Jesus.
I just remember that being a David Letterman thing.
It was.
I used to do the thing if I ever had to eat, especially for like school or church or something where I had to wear a tie. I would grab my sport coat and do it back and forth so the tie knot would wiggle back and forth like you used to do.
Wow. You must have been very popular.
Yeah.
Well, hello, and welcome to Cinema Shock, the podcast exploring the stories behind your favorite cult and genre films. I am your co-host, and I did an intro perfectly. My name is Gary Horne.
Well, yeah, pat yourself on the back there, Gary. Good job. I'm co-host Justin Bishop. We're joined today by writer, comedian, Tobe Hooper enthusiast, Mr. Todd A. Davis. Welcome to the show, Todd.
I'm very enthusiastic to be here. Thank you.
Turns out, remember how we started this podcast doing George Romero, and Todd liked about 2 out of the 10 movies that we talked about on that series. I think he liked Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead and hated everything else. No, you like Night Riders. You like Night Riders.
I love Night Riders.
3 out of 10.
3 out of 10.
Bat and a 0.3 or whatever that is. I don't know.
Maybe Tobe Hooper has a drama we could hit on, and Todd will like that. Todd just doesn't like the horror movies, and Todd considers himself a horror guy, so it's weird that it's
well. As it turns out, pretty much every film in this series is horror or horror centric, horror adjacent. Because there's a couple down the line that are like sci-fi horror, or lean a little more sci-fi.
I'm down for sci-fi.
But yeah, he didn't really have, his filmography is almost entirely horror. So,
but there's got to be.
I hate
there's
that Todd doesn't like
at least
horror
one. There's got to be at least one.
What?
Like,
well, I guess we'll find out.
Yeah.
I mean, have you seen Poltergeist before?
I've never seen Poltergeist.
Oh, he didn't direct it anyway, so. Whoa, controversial statement.
Whoa, shots fired.
We're going to talk about that another day. Anyway,
you know, one thing we didn't cover about Ed Neal last week that I thought was interesting too. I mentioned just casually his collection of movie posters, that we kind of laughed off.
Ed Neal, the hitchhiker from Texas Chainsaw.
Yeah. Did you know that he also went to work for the Museum of the Humanities or something? He was going to go to LA with Hooper and Henkel. I think he wanted to originally, but then he became one of the big haters on Hooper and Henkel, especially.
He was mad about not getting paid.
Yeah, which we'll talk about a little bit more, I guess, here. But the thing is that he also went to a garage sale or something. I can't find the exact thing now, but I was reading this earlier. He found when the mobster studio went out of business or whatever, kind of closed down, he found at a sell all of Tobe Hooper's stuff and the stuff from Chainsaw, and found like the A and B roll of the film and all of this stuff, and he bought it all, and he has all. Well, he donated the actual film, to the Museum of the Humanities and stuff like that. But I just thought that was really, really weird, just interesting.
Yeah, that's wild.
That's interesting.
I wonder if are there studio garage sales where you just? I mean, probably not so much nowadays, right?
Yeah, this
Where
was
they
probably
what
just
sell off? Where
they just
sell
sell
the
off a bunch
film?
of stuff?
No, they don't do that. No, this
Yeah.
was one that was owned by mobsters and they went out of business. This isn't your typical Hollywood studio. You're not going down to Warner Brothers and having a fucking estate sale where you can buy the ruby slippers from Gone with the Wind. What
Oh,
world do
come
you
on.
live in,
Those go
Todd?
up for sale all the time.
They're in the goddamn Smithsonian.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
You can't just buy them at a garage sale.
Okay, Smithsonian Museum estate sale. They've got a bunch of
So
stuff.
it's just like
It's
we gotta
like
get
a-
rid of it. Some of this shit's just real old and it's dusty.
I mean, Trauma might do that. This seems like a real Lloyd Kaufman move.
Like, I've been to the Smithsonian. You know, there's only like a third of that stuff is on display. There's got to be a whole bunch of shit in the back that
They're not going to
nobody
sell
wants.
it. It's just priceless. Anyway, welcome to part 2 of the tragedy of Tobe Hooper. So when last we left Mr. Tobe Hooper, he was riding high off the success, both critical and commercial, of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And while, as we discussed last week, he wouldn't really see any financial gains from that film upon its original release, it did get the attention of Hollywood, which was kind of his whole plan. Soon after that film's release, Tobe Hooper and his Chainsaw screenwriter Kim Henkel were offered a 3-picture deal with Universal Pictures. But before they could work on any new films for Universal, they had to satisfy a deal that they'd signed prior to that Universal contract being signed. That film, released in 1976, was released under various titles throughout its release. I think I counted like 8 different titles for this movie, but there were titles like Death Trap, Horror Hotel, Starlight Slaughter, but it's most commonly known as simply Eaten Alive.
If you were one of the millions of moviegoers who were electrified by the unbearable suspense and sheer terror of Jaws, get ready for Eaten Alive, created by Tobe Hooper, maker of the screen sensation The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Mardi Rustam presents a new horror classic, Eaten Alive. Into this house of terror comes a handful of unsuspecting innocents. What happens to these people in Eaten Alive will give you the most chilling, terrifying 90 minutes you ever spent in a theater. Mardi Rustam presents Eaten Alive. Mel Ferrer, Carolyn Jones, Stuart Whitman, Neville Brand. Get ready for Eaten Alive, a new horror classic.
You know, it's easy to imagine that when you make a movie like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that literally everybody knows you, you're a big star, and bam, you're just huge. But keep in mind that everything we told you last week, nothing's going to work that way for Tobe Hooper ever. He made arguably the greatest horror film of all time, and it was just getting recognition, but not always good recognition. We covered all this last week, but I just felt like recapping quickly. The movie came out, but due to all the process and deals it took to get made, none of the people making it were making any money. And even though the actors were stars now, or at least known, they didn't make anything really. And
it didn't exactly help their careers either. I know Marilyn Burns said that this was kind of a resume killer. Like, people, even though the movie was very successful, they'd see it on her resume and be like, oh, you were in that movie. You know, they didn't see it as a good thing as part of their filmography.
Yeah, and Tobe Hooper, by all accounts, he had no idea what the fuck was going on either. I mean, meanwhile, his movie's getting defended for like First Amendment arguments and debates, and it's getting crucified by journalists and other places. And even at one point, Joe Bob Briggs wrote in one of the articles I read that at a certain point, it even got to a point where the worst word in the title of the film wasn't chainsaw or massacre, it was Texas. People started attacking Texas. We're like, this is the only place this could happen, and they're a bunch of rubes and toxic males. This is a toxic male fantasy, and it's poisoning the minds of young men. Side note, not mentioning that there actually have been like articles delving deep into this and found that like lots of younger men actually identified very well with the stronger female in Marilyn Burns, and that was kind of a big deal for some of them. But anyway, you'd think at this point, after you make such an impact in the culture, you'd be golden. I think 95% of the actors that were involved in Texas Chainsaw Massacre thought Hooper had just kind of disappeared and gone on to big time in Hollywood without them. But in reality, much like our old friend Shane Black, he kind of just went quiet because that's how he handles things. And what the fuck's he supposed to do now anyway? None of this was shining a light on a path to Hollywood and what you what you're even supposed to do.
Well, I mean, he did get the attention of Hollywood. You know, he got that Universal contract, a 3-film contract, but getting Hollywood's attention, it wasn't like he didn't go from point A, Texas Chainsaw, to point B doing like a big studio picture. You know, it didn't work that way, and it rarely does. As a lot of filmmakers do, Hooper and Henkel, when they get to Hollywood, they went through a series of false starts for their next film. It's not like they got to Hollywood and immediately someone's like, hey, here's a script for Eaten Alive. You know, not that would have necessarily been their first choice anyway.
The mayor of Hollywood doesn't roll out the carpet and hand you your first project.
No, it doesn't work that way. So Chainsaw certainly became their calling card, and it led to several potential projects. Among that film's fans were guys like Stephen King, William Friedkin, and Steven Spielberg. Spielberg and Friedman both had deals at Universal at the time as well, and they had office spaces near Hooper's on the Universal lot. And Friedkin in particular was a big fan of Chainsaw, and he was actually the driving force behind getting the two Texans a development deal with the studio there at Universal. And he would tell Hooper, he said, you know, you really know how to make movies, and that's good. That'll come in handy. But let's talk about what's important, the bullshit. And what he means is simply all of the politics, bureaucracy, and, well, the bullshit that comes along with making movies for a major Hollywood studio.
Given his temperament, it sounds like Tobe Hooper loves dealing with bullshit. But it is pretty cool that Friedkin would sort of become his mentor. And I mean, Tobe Hooper, like in some of the,
and this is, you got to think, this is Friedkin right after The Exorcist, and this is Spielberg right after Jaws. Like, these are the two hottest directors in Hollywood right now.
Yeah, and I know that Tobe Hooper told a story about like just how impressive, like he didn't even realize like how much Chainsaw was catching on until he like saw an article on a paper like at a gas station, you know, like it just hadn't hit him exactly how big it was. And he saw like some news clip of Friedkin walking out of a screening with Dino De Laurentiis of Texas Chainsaw, and he's like, holy shit, like these people are walking out of a movie I made. And you know, that kind of thing. And just to establish, I mean, my understanding was from some of the interviews is that he was still in Austin all at this point when he saw this, and he'd been working on a bunch of projects, I guess, trying to get the attention or to figure out a way to get into LA, including one where he was writing a murder mystery set in LA that he thought he would get there.
Yeah. Well, immediately after Chainsaw, and this may have been that movie, Gary, because it was reported that Hooper and Henkel would be working on, well, no, I guess this was another horror movie. It was called Bleeding Hearts. That was a project that he had been working on, but it had kind of failed to materialize, as did another project called Dead and Alive, which was a proposed collaboration with Friedkin and a writer named L.M. Kit Carson. And that's a name that you'll hear come up much further down the line in the series. Dead and Alive was described by Carson as a quote from Carson, a story Tobe had about these two elderly ladies. One deals in parapsychology and thanatology, which is the study of death. Her sister runs a sort of insane California funeral home where people can die any way they want and videotape a final message to their relatives. They have a contraption there called the Apocalypse-O-Rama, which they rig together to create thunderstorms and hailstorms so the deceased can go out with a boom. But what these two old ladies really do is swap and trade souls that they capture the way kids trade baseball cards.
Oh,
and I would watch
Gary
the
V's
shit
going to be all over that.
That sounds like fun.
I would watch the shit out of that movie because that sounds wild, especially if you're familiar with Carson. That was from an interview that he did in Fangoria around the time that Texas Chainsaw 2 came out. But that didn't really happen. I don't know why it fell apart. It's just one of, you know, hundreds and thousands of, you know, projects in Hollywood that just, for one reason or another, just never happened. So instead, Hooper was offered the chance to direct a movie called Death Trap for a man named Mardi Rustam, who's a low-budget exploitation producer. Rustam had gotten his start as a producer with a couple of films by schlockmeister Al Adamson. Al Adamson is like not a good filmmaker, but he makes interesting films. The first of those was one called Dracula versus Frankenstein, not nearly as good as it sounds.
What's not good about that?
And then one called The Female Bunch. Both of those came out in 1971. The Female Bunch features Lon Chaney Jr. in his final film role and was filmed on the Spahn Ranch in 1969 during the time that the Manson family lived on the ranch.
Whoa.
Perfect. Well, that sounds exciting.
That sounds like an exciting behind the scenes story.
Yes.
Hey, that's an episode in and of itself.
He would follow those movies up with stuff like Lash of Lust and Psychic Killer, which that actually starred Creature from the Black Lagoon, starred Julie Adams, and featured Neville Brand in a prominent role.
Lon Chaney's a poopy pants. Did you,
what?
That just made me think. Did you look at that clip I put in our Discord about Charles Manson on Ted Bundy?
No, I didn't get a chance to watch it. No.
Oh man, it's so funny because they're just like this. We're off on a tangent now, but I'll be very brief. It's just that he's the journalist asks him about Ted Bundy. What does he say? He's a crumpkin or I forget the word. He's Bundy's a poopy pants. Like he's trying to impress his mama. Like, what's that got to do with me? Bitch, you don't know me. He's a poopy pants.
This is Charles Manson saying this.
Yeah, that's Charles Manson, and I loved it. Anyway, so it made me think of that. Lon Chaney's a poopy pants.
So the original.
Please cut that into the episode at random times, Gary.
So the original idea for Death Trap came from Rustam and a screenwriter named Alvin Fast, but Hooper and Henkel reworked the story to fit their particular style. So in the final film, Fast and Rustam get a written by credit, while Henkel gets a very strange adapted for the screen credit on the film. And I don't know why that is. I usually adapted for the screen would mean that it was based on maybe a TV show or even a book, but not just based on another screenplay. That's just called rewriting the screenplay. But I imagine it has something to do with Writers Guild stuff. I'm not really sure why that is, but it's very weird.
Yeah, that seems very odd. And maybe some of the story here is like one of those things where like people just remember different things in different times and we're only going off
Yeah,
memories.
I mean, this was 40 some odd years ago. So
because according to one interview I saw with Hooper, like he was basically saying he was still in Austin at the time Rustam started reaching out about Eaten Alive, or he said at that time it was Death Trap. He was working on this murder mystery thing set in LA. He thought that'll get you in LA, like you'll have to film there or something like that. And then he starts getting this call about Death Trap and he wasn't interested. He said, but they just kept calling over and over again. And Hooper saw it as this opportunity to go ahead and, all right, I'll take a role. I'll be a gun for hire and get into the town. And so he took it as long as he could be allowed to bring Henkel with him. And so Rustam agreed. They brought Henkel. Now on the other side of this is like Mardi Rustam, who's saying that, well, here's all that was going on for him was Jaws happened and it changed everything. And people wanted to make Jaws. So Al Fast was his buddy. And he said, hey, I got this idea about a big ass alligator and it eats people. And Marty says, hell yes. Which is, to be fair, what should always happen anytime somebody pitches a movie about giant killer animals. But they get their version written. And I think I saw they tried like two different directors and it wasn't clicking. But finally, Al Fast is the one who said, what about this Tobe Hooper guy? He did Chainsaw. And I hear he's trying to get new projects and get into LA. Let's go get him. And so that's when they went after Tobe. Obviously, considering how the movie turns out, and it's not just a giant croc movie, you see where Hooper and Henkel came in and they had other concerns, so they started working on.
Yeah, and as was the case with Chainsaw and the character of Ed Gein, it said that the character of Judd in this film, and this is what Hooper and Henkel, I think, brought along to the project, was based on a real-life person as well, a man named Joe Ball, a.k.a. the Butcher of Elmendorf.
Yeah.
This guy's story is fascinating, by the way. And I will say, just like we credited Joe Bob Briggs's article in Texas Monthly last week when we talked about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, this is actually also, a lot of this information also comes from a Texas Monthly article from the early 2000s, 2002, by a journalist named Michael Hall. There was this character, this sort of figure of Texas folklore, and Michael Hall went to Elmendorf and he started researching to find out if this was actually a real story or not.
That's pretty amazing. And I mean, clearly some of this is pulled from, and I know we're about to get into Joe Ball. The only other thing I saw, Rustam does say that Henkel and Hooper, that was one of their big things, was expanding on the character that Neville plays. The only other thing Hooper mentioned was he based like one thing off of it, of the oldest man in the world article he saw in like Life magazine or something, where like the guy snorted BC powder. And so I just thought,
I
was
saw
wondering
that.
about that.
I
And I
saw
saw
him talking
that.
about
Yeah, I was just like, man, that's awesome. Because I
Yeah.
was like, what a weird thing that this guy's just like snorting his BC. That's
Well,
so
the
odd.
powder is in the powder. So
But anyway, but Joe Ball, obviously.
Yeah,
Clearly.
so Joe Ball. Joe Ball was a World War I veteran who, after the war, began making a living as a bootlegger during Prohibition. Once Prohibition ended, alcohol continued to be his main source of income, and he would soon open his own establishment in his hometown of Elmendorf, Texas, which was a saloon called the Sociable Inn.
It sounds friendly enough.
yeah,
It sounds friendly. Yeah, sociable. He built a small pond next to the saloon in which he housed 6 live alligators. It is said that he would actually charge guests to see the gators, and especially during feeding time, in which you've got a bunch of drunken Texans hanging around an alligator pit, and he would sometimes throw live cats and dogs to the reptiles and charge people
Jesus.
like 50 cents to go watch it.
This was
And
the
it
part
was-
that depressed me most about all of this story, even Tobe Hooper's. It's just that they
dogs.
would just get like stray cats and dogs and throw
Yeah.
them in the pond with alligators.
And it became like this this like Roman Colosseum of bumfuck Texas. So Ball employed a number of women at the Sociable Inn as waitresses and bartenders, and a lot of these women would just kind of end up disappearing. So one of the people that ended up disappearing was a waitress named Minnie Gotthard. That was in 1937. Not long after Gotthard disappeared, Ball married another one of his waitresses, a woman named Dolores Goodwin. She would disappear in 1938, the next year. And then a few months after that, another of Ball's women, Hazel Brown, went missing.
Did anybody refer to these women as the ballers?
I
Mm.
don't think so.
Okay.
But probably Joe Ball did. Like he was just like, I'm Joe Ball and I'm balling. No, that's a stupid joke. I hate that.
That's a very dumb
I,
movie. This is 1937.
I hate everything about this whole conversation, and I'd like to move on.
We'll blame it on Todd. So after Brown went missing, local authorities got reports that Ball had left a strange smelling barrel behind a neighbor's barn. So authorities had also been alerted to the fact that several women in Ball's life had mysteriously disappeared. So they decided it might be a good idea to look into that, maybe bring this guy in for questioning. So when
Detectives.
deputies arrived at the Sociable Inn to arrest Ball, he made a final request. He wanted to close down his bar and have one last drink. And the deputies, for some reason, agreed. So Ball walks to his cash register, hits the no sell button, pulls out a gun, and shoots himself in the heart.
Now that's a baller. You don't shoot yourself in the head. You shoot yourself in the heart. Like
In
that
the
seems
heart.
like the worst. It's like when people stab themselves. It's like, what are you
Yeah.
thinking? Like go for the easy out. Like there is a 99% chance you know where your brain is. Like just eliminate that. But it's like the heart, I'm not 100% sure I could hit my heart. I don't know. I think it's in this general left region of my chest. But with my luck, I would fuck that up. And so, but
Yeah, just have a hole in your body. So after Ball's death, the saloon's handyman, a guy named Clifford Wheeler, confessed to authorities that he had indeed helped his boss murder Gotthard and Brown and helped to dispose of the bodies, even leading them to Brown's remains. Goodwin, by the way, Ball's wife, who had disappeared, was alive and well. She had simply walked out on her husband and moved to San Diego. Probably because he was a murderous bastard,
Well, the story was like some of the stuff I saw in this little documentary about it was that, he had told Goodwin about murdering Minnie. Like he had told her that he had murdered the other one. Or wait, whichever one was the wife, doesn't matter. The point is, the one that he was married to first that disappeared, he told the next lover, I murdered that one. In reality, she had just left and went to the sister. And so
Goodwin was the one that left, and the one after that was Hazel Brown.
Well, the story of the documentary is that one told the other about Ball murdering the wife, and they weren't supposed to share that information. And so then the one that got told was also seeing Ball on the side. So they were both banging Ball.
Ball.
Yeah, they were both balling, so to speak, right? Oh, God. Anyway, but then one of them found a husband or a guy to be her potential husband was going to leave, and Ball didn't want her to leave. And then she said, well, if you don't let me go, I'm going to tell him about Dolores, who you killed. And then he realized his new girlfriend had told his side piece about the murder. And so then he killed both of them and fed them to the gators.
There was never even any evidence found that Ball had actually fed any of his victims to the alligators.
That's true. That's fair.
That didn't stop that urban legend from growing. Like that's he became known in that part of Texas. Even now, he's known as the alligator killer.
I'm just saying a lot of people could have been saved a lot of trouble if there was just some more clarification here. If,
but yeah, so he became kind of a legend in that part of Texas. The alligator man, the alligator killer, the butcher of Elmendorf. This guy who was basically a serial killer and was feeding his victims to his pet alligators. Even if you go to Elmendorf now and you ask people about Joe Ball, they're like, yeah, that's the guy who killed all of his wives and fed them to alligators. That's like a local legend.
Yeah. Well, you get the rumors now, and the rumors go all the way to like there were 20 gators in that pit, and he killed like upwards of 14 women or something, and that sort of thing. So as it goes.
Yeah. So and much like Joe Ball himself, the character of Judd in Eaten Alive is a decorated veteran. Joe Ball was a veteran of the First World War, while Judd in the movie is a veteran of Vietnam. And the man who was cast in the role of Judd was known as one of the most decorated heroes of World War II, an actor by the name of Neville Brand.
And side note, yeah, there's a good possibility Neville Brand killed multiple women.
It's very, very
I just
possible.
Would not doubt it. I would not be like surprised if it came out.
Not at all. This guy is fascinating. So born in Iowa in 1920, Neville Brand was a veteran of old Hollywood. He had been a sergeant and platoon leader during the war, and he was wounded in action in April of 1945. He got shot in the shoulder and nearly bled to death. He was awarded the Silver Star, which is the second highest decoration of valor in the U.S. military. He was also awarded the Purple Heart, the Good Conduct Medal, the American Defense Service Medal, the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 3 battle stars, 1 overseas service bar, 1 service stripe, and the Combat Infantry Badge. Like when I say that he was one of the most decorated veterans of World War II, that is literal. They're like he's described as the second most decorated soldier in the entire war.
Wow.
And when I say that he may or may not have killed multiple women, one thing is for certain, he is not killless. He has certainly killed someone.
He has killed people. So after being discharged from the Army in 1945, he got his first taste of Hollywood when working on a U.S. Army Signal Corps film with Charlton Heston. And then he later enrolled in drama school on the GI Bill. So he began to work in small parts in film and television in the early 1950s before becoming a leading man himself in 1953's Man Crazy. And then that was followed by one of his most well-known films, which is Don Siegel's Riot in Cell Block 11, the film that Quentin Tarantino actually called the best prison film ever made. Other well-known roles included a role in Billy Wilder's Stalag 17, outstanding movie if you haven't seen it. John Frankenheimer's Birdman of Alcatraz. I think he played an Alcatraz prison guard in that one. But one of probably his most well-known role to most people was as Al Capone in the early 60s TV series The Untouchables.
Okay.
Brand played he played literally in hundreds of roles throughout his career, mostly in like guest roles on television, honestly. Like he did a lot of TV, but he was most known as like a television character actor. And here's a little Star Trek connection for you, Todd. He appeared in a 1964 episode of The Twilight Zone called The Encounter alongside George Takei.
Oh, fun.
And he would often play the villain in a lot of movies and a lot of TV shows. He started to kind of gain the reputation for playing a villain when he was in a movie in 1956 called Love Me Tender. It's a movie that stars Elvis. He played a character that killed Elvis's character in that movie and was sort of branded a villain at that point. Plus, look at his face.
Yeah.
Like even if you look at young pictures of Neville Brand, he looks like a killer. He looks like a villain. He looks like he is not a romantic lead. He looks like he's been punched many times. So in the mid 1970s, Brand, he admitted in a TV interview, or in a magazine interview, that he was an alcoholic. He had suffered from alcoholism, and he'd spent most of his fortune that he had, the money that he'd made in film and television over the years. That may have led him to take a handful of questionable roles with exploitation filmmakers, including Mardi Rustam. As we mentioned before, Brand had appeared in Rustam's Psychic Killer in 1975. That's a movie that Rustam actually directed in addition to producing and writing. And that was the film that Rustam had done just before Eaten Alive. And Brand would also appear in Rustam's, probably his most well-known film as a director, which was 1985's Evils of the Night. So they would continue to collaborate even after Eaten Alive.
Y'all, Neville Brand was wild.
He is wild.
And there's plenty to get into with him if we can get to it a little bit later on some of it. But for starters, just now, saying he suffered from alcoholism does not paint the perfect picture. This guy was dealing with some shit. To hear Hooper describe it, the first time he met Brand, he was yellow. Not like a coward, like his skin was literally tinged
like he had jaundice.
Yellow. Yeah. And he drank constantly, like just never was not drinking. And Hooper liked the idea of Brand, but was really worried about him on the account of him being, drunk all the time. Like when I do this show. So Hooper is thinking, can this guy even remember lines? How is this going to work? And Rustam really wanted him because, they'd worked together, obviously, and they liked each other enough that apparently like Neville Brand was like, told his agent, just make this happen, whatever it takes to make this movie happen. Like, let's just go ahead and work it out, make the deal.
Well, he also kind of said, he was like, I am this guy, which is terrifying.
But yeah, what I was going to say is that there was this character that Hooper and Henkel had sort of fleshed out into a more prominent role, but they were still working out specifics. And according to Hooper, like Brand just came in and had this passion and was like, please let me do this role. I know him. I can do this. And he did. And ended up, apparently, like most of his lines are just like ad-lib bullshit that Neville Brown said. He was just a weirdo. Like Hooper describes in one scene, just for a taste, that like there's the scene where like after he kills one of the guys, he's walking along that porch and he starts to walk down the stairs. And he said Neville Brown just stopped. And then he just stood there for a minute. What?
Neville Brand,
sorry. Neville Brand just stopped and he like stood there for a minute and he was like blank. And then he said he literally like just went, I'm here, and just kept going.
Wow. Yeah, he's a character,
he was
man.
Like, I don't know with this guy. Like, I don't know what's up with him.
Well, Roberta Collins, who we'll talk about in a second, but she is the actress who plays the prostitute at the beginning of the movie with like the Marilyn Monroe hair. Mm-hmm. She tells a story on the commentary for this movie. She had kind of become friends with Brand through the making of this, and they were hanging out like what she was described as completely platonic. And they were hanging out like at his house one day after the shoot of the movie. And he just kind of like went crazy on her. Like he like starts running after her through her house. Like, well, they like laid down next to each other on his bed or couch, and they were just like,
she said she was like fully clothed and like that they had been drinking or something. He was like, you can stay here or whatever. That they like laid next to each other on the bed, but she was like even in a parka, she said. He said something like, no lady ever lays down next to me like fully clothed or something like that. And then he starts chasing her and he chases her out of his house. Like she's terrified. Said she lived the movie like with him. Yeah. They were like good friends. And then all of a sudden, like just one night he like snaps. There's stories about him like being on the Universal back lot, like on the tour tram, just like running up and just taking a piss all over it. And, like there's just like he has stories of like if you look him up, it's like he was married like 3 times, not necessarily divorces recorded. Like he just
wow.
did what the fuck he felt like.
Yeah. I mean, it's very possible that he was, in addition to the alcoholism, like. We don't know what prompted that, but it could very well have been he saw some shit, in the war. I mean, he was a war veteran, and he wasn't like sitting on the sidelines. Like he was a combat veteran of World War II and saw some atrocities that probably led to his alcoholism and possibly could have led to some deep-rooted psychological issues.
Yeah,
and combine deep-rooted psychological issues with heavy drinking, and your brain's fucked up. And his brain seemed to be pretty fucked up in several ways.
Yeah.
So Neville Brand was one of several Hollywood veterans that appears in Dead Alive. Starring alongside him were Mel Ferrer, who is known for his roles in films like Scaramouche and Knights of the Round Table, where he played King Arthur. His late career, though, included quite a lot of exploitation cinema as well. He appeared in a lot of Italian horror films later in his career, including Umberto Lenzi's 1980 film, also coincidentally titled Eaten Alive, but with like an exclamation point at the end.
Oh, so not the same Eaten Alive.
Different Eaten Alive. This one's one of the many, many, many Italian cannibal movies that were coming out in the early 80s.
Mel Ferrer, by the way, like, I mean, he was not, he had worked with Rustam before. So like he was pitched to Hooper from Rustam, and Hooper talks great about him. Like, just loves him, just talks about how smooth he is as a veteran of acting. Like he was just like
he doesn't look down on the fact that he's doing an exploitation movie.
Oh yeah, no, he's taking the role. He's doing what he's got to do, and that's a good point, Justin. Like, I mean, a lot of these people you'll see talk about it, and like even Mardi Rustam, and like in some of the stuff saying like, you know, like it's easy to I think it was him or someone, but they were talking about, you know, like it's easy to like write people off sometimes. Like people do this to actors all the time. I even think about like action stars today, that it's like, it's not any different. Like it's always been this way. Like you're hot for a while, and then eventually like you've got to do what you got to do to survive. And you take your roles, and so Ferrer was doing this thing. I mean, he was a well-known guy at the time, even though you wouldn't, maybe he's not as famous today as he would have been, but you know, they were saying like where I was going before was Hooper was talking about like, man, he was amazing, like in editing, you know, like he knew about editing. He was like, every one of these guys like had their own skill, and he was like, this wasn't digital. Like you couldn't just fix it the same way. It was like if you had to redo a scene, you know, like it's a lot more difficult, like editing everything together. Ferrer was literally the exact same in every scene, and he would adjust like his vocal tone to like match what I was looking for. His positioning of his hands, his movement, his steps, like he was every take, like was a
total professional.
Yeah,
Nice.
it was amazing.
Yeah, so in this movie, in Eaten Alive, Ferrer plays Harvey Wood, who is the older man, the dying father who's searching for his daughter in the movie. So Stuart Whitman, who plays the sheriff in it, had appeared in films like Night of the Lepus, and the role of the madam, Miss Hattie, the madam in the brothel, is Carolyn Jones, who is best known, of course, for her role of Morticia Addams in the 1960s Addams Family TV show.
Okay,
And she is.
I thought her voice sounded familiar.
Yeah, it was. But at this point, she's got more of a bit of a smoker's voice.
Yeah.
She was a longtime smoker and died at a fairly young age. She's made up to look much older in this movie, but she died. She was only in her late 40s when they made this movie, and she died at the age of 53. So just a couple years after this. But yeah, so but she was also described as just like a consummate professional on this. Like she and people were starstruck. I mean, Tobe Hooper grew up watching the Addams Family, you know, like this was his first quote unquote Hollywood movie, even though it wasn't exactly a studio picture, but he's getting to work with these actors like this that he kind of grew up on, you know, like he grew up watching Knights of the Round Table. And
That's awesome.
Well, if I could say, I mean, one of the things we mentioned with Tarantino was his ability to cast these great actors in these smaller roles, and I didn't know
people who were
before.
past their heyday.
Yeah, and maybe you knew this, but I did not. They call this stunt casting, and here's an example, or maybe that's a term that developed later. I don't know, but here's an example of Hooper doing this in the 70s. Yeah. Like before, like a guy like Tarantino came along and was doing the same thing. Like it was, I mean, these guys were casting. Hooper cared more about characters than he did like a giant monster. And that's even prevalent back in Texas Chainsaw, probably. Like
for sure.
He had different ideas about, he wasn't just trying to make a monster. He was trying to
monsters
make like
are often characters as well.
Right.
So alongside these Hollywood veterans were new up-and-coming actors, many of whom made a name for themselves working in genre films. Of course, returning to work with Hooper once again was Texas Chainsaw's Marilyn Burns. Janice Blythe, who plays Lynette, she is a character, man. She's fun. She would later appear just after this as Ruby in both of Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes films. And Janice Blythe, if you have the Arrow Blu-ray of this, there's an interview with her, and she is an entertaining character. I really am infatuated with her.
I'd still date her.
Yeah,
Like,
she's fun.
she seems like a lot of fun. Like she
seems like a lot of fun. And then Roberta Collins, who I mentioned earlier, who plays Judd's first victim of the film, Clara Wood. She had appeared in films like Jack Hill's The Big Dollhouse, Paul Bartel's Death Race 2000, which was one of many Roger Corman produced films that she'd appeared in. She was a veteran of Roger Corman's.
That Big Dollhouse is like a Pam Grier movie. Like she's definitely Grindhouse style.
Oh, absolutely, movie. Yeah. Big Dollhouse is I would say might be the movie that put Pam Grier on the map. Honestly, really good. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend checking out those early Jack Hill movies. He did. It's a women in prison movie. Jack Hill did a few of those and some blaxploitation movies around that same time. Continued to work with Pam Grier, but I guess we'll talk about that on a Jack Hill series one day, or a Pam Grier series, or
nice
a blaxploitation series. I don't know. We'll get into it, but I would really like to explore his filmography. Then you've got Kyle Richards, who plays the little girl Angie, and I know Gary knows who Kyle Richards is.
I know her. She's one of the Real Housewives.
She is a Real Housewife. That's true, but she also is Lindsay Wallace in John Carpenter's Halloween, which is just a couple years.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Not really. No, yeah, she is definitely Lindsay Wallace. She's coming back.
Yeah, she's coming back as Lindsay Wallace in, well, we should have already seen it, but in David Gordon Green's
fucking Halloween pandemic Kills. Is ruining everything for me. I'm going to die before Halloween Kills comes out.
And William Finley, who gives an absolutely insane performance here, which I wish he was in the movie more, but his character is unfortunately cut short because he gets murdered. But he was a regular player in the films of Brian De Palma, and most well known as the title character, and in my favorite De Palma film,
as it should be,
Phantom of the Paradise.
Yeah.
And Tobe Hooper was also a big fan of Phantom of the Paradise, so that's primarily probably why William Finley got the job. And they would go on to work together again. William Finley appears in The Funhouse and in Night Terrors, both with Tobe Hooper again later on. And of course, in an integral role in the film is Buck, who's raring to fuck, is a young pre-Freddy Krueger Robert Englund. And this is his first of 4 collaborations with Tobe Hooper.
Weird. So, like, here's another example. Just like, God, I love this new show so much because we're like doing these stories and then we find connections. And I feel like it's even more so than before with Psychotronic. Like, it's like they just lead perfectly. I don't know. It's fun. Like, I don't even know if you thought about this, Justin. I did not know the Buck and fuck thing was a thing prior to Quentin Tarantino.
No, I did not know that was something that I guess you can always assume that Tarantino is getting that from somewhere, but I did not know.
I mean, Quentin Tarantino rips like something from a Grindhouse movie. Who'd have thunk it? But
yeah, but and it's the first line of the entire movie is name's Buck, raring to fuck.
Yeah,
and it's I honestly love Robert Englund's delivery of that line too.
I do too.
I think he's really great in this movie. I mean, he's a scumbag. He's a total scumbag.
Yeah.
But he's having a blast.
He really is.
You can tell watch. Oh man,
this is his first horror movie.
So I was about to ask how early in his career this was.
Before Freddy.
This is 6 years before Freddy, but he had been primarily a stage actor prior to this, like Shakespearean. Like Robert Englund was a legit like up and coming stage actor, and he got tired of the bullshit of the theater. So he's like, if I'm gonna deal with political bullshit, I'm gonna do it in Hollywood.
Yeah,
that was basically his thinking. He's like,
yeah, what was the movie he said anyway, he like
the movies?
Yeah, he said he like went off to do the theater because he was tired of Hollywood. So he decided he was going to devote his life to theater. He was tired of the bullshit. He had done all of the stuff. He was accepted the Royal Academy, blah, blah, blah. So he went into that. And then he was watching Boxcar Bertha, was what he said.
Yeah, Scorsese.
Scorsese. And he said he started looking at the credits at the end of the movie. He was like, this is fun. And he's like seeing all his friends he had worked on this movie. And he's like, well, God damn it. Like, if I'm going to be dealing with the same bullshit, I'm just going to go back to Hollyweird. That's his exact quote. Like, I'm just going to go back there. And so he got cast in Bertha and Billy, which made a lot of money for Ted Mann, who that's probably a whole other story, but Ted Mann
cast Chinese theater.
Yeah, he owns Mann's Chinese theater, bought all the Fox theaters, and he said that Bertha and Billy money made him like a huge deal. Robert
England's first like starring role, I believe, right?
Yeah, it was his first starring role.
Yeah.
And Hooper saw that. So like immediately when Robert Englund walked on set, Hooper knew who he was. Hooper says he knew who he was and was like, I know that guy. And he said like Marty was like, are you sure? And he says, no, this guy is special. This guy is something special about this guy. Like I've got to have this guy. Like he just knew it. And Marilyn Burns even talks about in interviews, it's like how special she felt being on the set with this cast. And you know, I mean, she talks about it being a resume killer with Texas Chainsaw, but she was always after attention. She actually like kind of, I swear some of the interviews, she seems like she's kind of reveling a little bit in the controversy that there's a movie that she's in that has created such a discussion, you know, so she was excited to work with Hooper and Henkel again. And so when the opportunity came up, she jumped on it. And she
only did one other movie in between. I think she was in Helter Skelter. And I think that's the only other movie she made in between Texas Chainsaw and this.
I think you're right. And so she jumped on this. And once she tells the story of like what she saw, like who all the people she was working with were going to be. It's like these people she's seen all over TV and everything. She like called her parents to brag about it. It's like, you got to go see this movie. And they brought their whole bridge club to come see this movie. And she was like, of course, at that time, I was unaware that there was an opening scene that had been added with a brothel.
The very first scene is I'm Buck raring to fuck.
Right.
And a close-up of Robert Englund's zipper.
Right, exactly. She was like, so that was interesting. But But yeah, Robert Englund, you know, at this point, he's a guy who's you hear him talk, and that maybe there's a whole Robert Englund series too someday. But he's a guy who appreciates old Hollywood. Like he loves it. He talks about going to Hollywood parties. He goes to the old Hollywood parties. He wants to meet Ernest Borgnine. Like he's like, I could hang out with him. Like, you know, he's excited about that stuff. So he said he was right around the corner. He said, I could walk to this place and it's run down studio. And I walk in, and the first thing I see is this peeling old hotel set and a weird pond, and Neville Brown's like pacing around smoking a cigarette. And I'm like, fuck yes, this is it. This is everything I dreamed of.
So Eaten Alive went before cameras with a reported budget of $600,000, which is 10 times the amount that Hooper had for Texas Chainsaw. Still pretty low budget even for this time. Much of that budget was reportedly raised on the guarantee of Hooper's participation. They sold this movie based on his name. The guy from Texas Chainsaw is making this movie. Unlike Chainsaw, which was, of course, as we discussed, shot entirely on location, Eaten Alive was shot entirely on sound stages. With Raleigh Studios in Hollywood standing in for Hooper's backwater motel and swamp in this film. And shooting on sound stages wasn't a budgetary concern. This was actually an artistic choice on Hooper's part. He wanted the film to have this false-looking feel, this fairy tale, like he describes it as a Wizard of Oz type feel, where it's very clearly this otherworldly location that you're in.
He had that back in Texas Chainsaw. You remember? I mean, it started out as like a Hansel and Gretel thing.
Right, yeah, the fairy tale.
I mean, he has this obsession with. He's misunderstood, I think, is a big part of, and probably how we'll deal with his whole career here as we go into it. But he views horror as like there's this mix of fantasy in it, and so it's not all like straightforward. He's not making Halloween, like he's not even necessarily trying to scare you in the way that like John Carpenter was trying to scare you. Like he's not. He's having fun with it. Like he wants it to be like a little bit. There's these parts that are like fantastical and funny, or like you should be like, what the hell is happening here?
Right.
You know?
And one thing that I think might have enticed Hooper about this particular story was its setting. Because if you'll recall, when we talked about Hooper's upbringing in our last episode, Hooper's father was in the hotel business. So Hooper grew up on the road a lot in hotels and motels, even spending some parts of his youth in nearby Louisiana. So it's very possible that like he's seen some seedy looking hotels like the Starlight, you know, and that might have had some, maybe not inspiration, but something that kind of drew him to this project.
Well, even Miss Hattie and the brothel, like, I mean, he says that was a real place in Austin. like
Yeah.
or
And
Southwest.
Miss Hattie was a real person. Like
She was a real person. Like he pulled some real life experience in from that stuff.
Well, I think a large part of this film's atmosphere, this kind of sleazy feeling of this film, can be attributed to that set, that motel set, which was that was created under the supervision of Hooper and his art director Marshall Reed. It makes me feel like the farmhouse in Texas Chainsaw. Like everything looks very lived in. Only in that one, they found an actual rundown farmhouse, and then Bob Burns threw bones on everything, which is amazing. But in this one, they had to create this all from scratch. And you've got these rotting sets, torn wallpaper. You've got water damage on the walls and floors. And like it's a really outstanding set, I think. And I think it all contributes to this like dive-like quality of the Starlight Hotel. And it's all shot in this weird otherworldly glow of primary colors, a lot of red lighting by cinematographer Robert Caramico, who, by the way, is another genre vet. He worked on a lot of sleazy exploitation and blaxploitation movies all throughout the 1970s. So this guy was well-versed in this world. And I honestly, I really love the look of this movie, even though it's deliberately fake looking, and I kind of dig that about it.
Yeah, I mean, when you watch interviews with him about this thing, I mean, again, he's talking about this with the monkey dying in the cage. Like he's talking about, I'm trying to think of a way to word this. Like it feels like he's just operating on a different plane sometimes. Like I don't know. Yeah. Like you can't get inside his mind necessarily, but he does have.
Hooper is a notoriously internal director. As in, like multiple people describe him coming on set, and he kind of like folds in on himself. Like he's not like a very boisterous, outspoken director. He kind of like internalizes all of his thoughts,
and so then he creates a vision. Like he creates a vision of what he wants to do with the movie, and so like people have drawn it out of him. Like you'll see in interviews with like the monkey dying, for instance, he talks about the red lighting, the red tinge to the lighting. He's like solar flares and weird stuff happening on solar flares. I was thinking of this, and like he's like, I believe that. Like I believe this. Like there's a weird thing, and this monkey just knew it was his time to die, and then weird stuff starts happening in solar flares. So he's trying to like explain it to you, but it's just even then it's still like I don't know. It's hard to explain. Like it's hard.
Well, I think that you're right. I think that he just like you said, he operates on a different wavelength. You know, and sometimes that makes it hard to verbalize those kind of things. But he knows what he's trying to get across, and whether we as the viewer understand that there's nothing about solar flares in the movie. But there's something weird going on that is sort of unexplainable.
Well, it's even like when you talk about a guy like William Finley, you know, who he'd seen in like Phantom of the Paradise and that sort of thing. You know, he even describes like him and Marilyn Burns in their scene. He says, I feel bad for Kyle, the little girl. He's like, she's plunged into madness. Tobe got all these great people together. The girl was having to operate in this den of scoundrels. Like there's like these weird people, and we all have different methods. And he's like, and he even describes at the time, like, you don't know exactly what's happening. He's like, I never knew when I'm searching for my gouged out eyeball on the floor. Like I never knew exactly what I was doing.
Yeah. And Kim Henkel, like, the writer of the movie, I think, couldn't even explain to him exactly what that was in the script for.
But he said, like, Tobe kept telling him, and we kind of experienced this a little in Texas Chainsaw, that like Tobe kept telling him, like, just go with it. It's gonna work. Like we're gonna figure it out. Like we're gonna, you know. And Tobe, because like even in Texas Chainsaw, remember, like he was filming stuff, and like those people said everything was just happening, and nobody knew. Like everybody was like kind of off kilter.
What was?
But Tobe knew he knew once he had a chance, that he just had to film as much stuff as he could, and I'll fix it in editing. Like I'll make this a movie.
Yeah, like he knew what his plan was, even if it wasn't apparent to other people. I think some of those things, though, like that scene in particular with William Finley, his and Marilyn Burns' characters are so fascinating in this movie to me, because it's like they exist in a movie of their own somewhere off screen. where we don't know if there's something very dysfunctional about them. Why is she wearing a disguise when she arrives? What the fuck is going on with him? Because like that moment where he's like twisting, he's got his arm reached out towards her head and he's like twisting his face. And none of that is explored in the movie, but I think it's purposeful. I think it's supposed to like put the audience off their guard, where you're supposed to wonder what in the hell is just going on. It adds to kind of the atmosphere. It's honestly one of my favorite sequences in the movie. Part of that's because I love William Finley. I think William Finley is
he's fantastic,
an amazing actor, and so fun to watch. And
well, and if you watch this movie and you haven't seen anything else and you just watch this, you're gonna think he's like a fucking weirdo. But I mean,
he's not. He's
very
just
he's just doing what he's
actor.
directed to do.
Yep.
Like he's doing what his role requires. Like
he does a bit of commentary on that scene on the Arrow Blu-ray, and he's even like, "Ooh, that's creepy. What am I doing? Like this is what?" Like he's. It's not like he's got some weird reasoning behind it. He's like, that's what was in the script.
But he even says there, I mean, that's one of the points I'm talking about. He says there, like, you never felt like at the time it was off, because Toby would like reassure you that like, it's fine, just go with it.
Trust me,
this will work.
Yeah. Well, and again, just like in Texas Chainsaw, I think a big part of the film's atmosphere, because this film, regardless of what you might think of it, you can't deny that it has some pretty stellar atmosphere. A lot of that comes from the sound design. Once again, Tobe Hooper and Wayne Bell are credited with the film's music once again. And it doesn't, even though that it says music by Tobe Hooper and Wayne Bell, it doesn't really have a score so much as a series of disconcerting noises. Much like Texas Chainsaw. Texas Chainsaw didn't have a traditional film score. And it should also be noted that Wayne Bell is not a composer. He's a sound effects designer. So they didn't hire a composer. They wanted somebody to come in and create this weird dissident noise, which creates just a weird feeling in the movie, you know? And then you've got these weird country songs that Judd is constantly listening to, that have the weirdest lyrics, and you're like, and that adds just a whole nother creepy layer to the film. Like, what is, like, you're in a nightmare in this movie. And I talked about that last week on Texas Chainsaw. That's one thing that you're going to see throughout Tobe Hooper's filmography, I think, is like he can create the atmosphere of a waking nightmare.
That's his goal. That's what's so weird about it. Like, yeah, it's one thing to like direct the actors and to tell like a narrative, but he's trying to tap into in the 70s, by the way, which like later you're going to see a lot of in Hollywood now. I think it's a pretty popular thing people try to do, is like they try to lean into like, oh, well, a lot of it's the atmosphere, a lot of it's the how it feels, how the movie
that's why
feels.
things like that William Finley scene, which logically don't make a lot of sense because it's just kind of dropped in, but that's that nightmare logic, that dream logic. Like, it doesn't have to make sense. Sometimes in your dreams, things just happen and they're weird and they don't necessarily make sense when you go back and think about them. But that's kind of what's happening all throughout this movie.
Yeah, and then there's an alligator.
Yeah, that is true.
What looks like an inflatable alligator?
We're going to talk about that
alligator.
We'll
talk about that alligator.
We are going to get to the alligator, right?
But Eaten Alive was not to be the sophomore success that Hooper was hoping for. In fact, Tobe Hooper left the production before filming was complete because he was clashing with producers, specifically with Mardi Rustam. It's unclear exactly what those creative differences were, but some reports say that Mardi Rustam requested more nudity in the film, and Hooper had no intention of taking the movie in the direction of softcore pornography. Other reports say that Rustam saw the film as a comedy, while Hooper viewed it as more serious. And that one's a little harder for me to believe based on some of the other films in Hooper's filmography. I feel like Hooper would have probably leaned more into the comedic aspects of it. I would honestly almost see it as being the other way around.
Yeah, Hooper's never been like obsessed with. Well, we talked about last week. He had like ideas that Texas Chainsaw was a comedy. So
right,
like,
exactly.
he's not obsessed with being too serious,
being overly serious.
But no, like I definitely found interviews on YouTube and such where he talks a little bit about how there were ideas from producers that like that their kids start showing up on set. Like he was just like, I just want to get to a movie. The story he tells actually is that like he didn't know at the time, like he was doing it as a gun for hire. He was doing this movie and he just needed a job. He needed to get to Hollywood. He needed a job. He had it. And so he was going to do it his way. They agreed to let him work on it his way. And then all of a sudden the producers start stepping in. Producers start telling him how to do things like, no, we should do this. We want to add this to the script, yada, yada, yada. And he's like, it's not till I walked, like I started, he was like, I think he said he like tried to leave a couple of times. And then finally there was a Japanese journalist on set that was a well-respected film critic in Japan that was on set a lot. And he sat down for an interview with him one day. And he was talking to this guy, and forgive me, I don't have his name, but he said the guy mentioned to him that the reason that Mardi Rustam like was able to get this financing, the financing that they had, was because they had attached Tobe Hooper to this movie. And Tobe Hooper's like, well, what the fuck? Like, yeah. So the only reason
to make it a Tobe Hooper movie.
Yeah. So he's like so I'm like bowing to like all these different directives from this producer. And like, the only reason this movie's happening is because I'm the one directing it.
Right.
And so finally he's like, one day they just like came in and were like, no, we're doing it this way or something. And he's just like, fuck you. Like, I'm out. Like, I'm leaving. And he walked out. And it was just like, to hear him talk about it, it's just like, no, it's just like every day. It was just like, somebody's like, we got to blow that croc's head off with like, it swallows a grenade or something, you know, like, it's like, he's just like, there's always the producer's kids have ideas and there's like constant, like other stuff. And he's just like, fuck this. Like, I'm not doing, I can't do this.
Well, the fact remains that Hooper did not finish the film. So instead, Rustam and editor Michael Brown reportedly directed the remainder of the shoot. Actress Carolyn Jones even apparently directed a few scenes. Here's what Robert Englund told Fangoria magazine about it when he was asked about it. He said, Tobe left that movie under rather unpleasant circumstances. They raised close to $500,000 on his name alone in Japan, yet they pestered him more and more. They violated his sense of rhythm. I got along terrifically with these people, talking about the producers, but of all things you need to pester Tobe about, he's going to deliver. You have to let him delve into things his own way. It was so disappointing when he left the project. Yeah. And the scenes that Rustam ended up directing added some of the sleaze and nudity that he wanted Hooper to feature, like that opening scene with Buck and Robert Englund and the prostitute. That was something that Rustam directed. And some of the later scenes with Janice Blythe, if you listen to her in interviews, like she was really looking forward to working with Tobe Hooper. And then she gets there and Mardi Rustam's directing the scene. Tobe Hooper had already left.
Yeah, some of that Mardi Rustam stuff was also it was Robert Carmichael, who was like a cameraman, and he was a good buddy of Mardi Rustam, who apparently, I mean, you know, for what it's worth, the story there is like he had recommended somebody because Mardi Rustam was trying to make this like low budget independent movie, so he had recommended a cameraman, and as they got like a decent bit into production, it was just too slow. To hear Tobe Hooper talk about it, they were used to like cameras that moved faster, and they had the ability to like get around quicker and catch different shots. That wasn't the case here. They had the I think I even saw like William Finley talking about, they had like this hulk of a camera that was like on a track, like running around and like that sort of thing. And so Mardi Rustam had told Carmichael about, like, man, this guy's not fast enough. Like it's not working. And so Carmichael is like, well, I'm in between projects. I'll just come in. And he did it. And then the union, he was a union guy, and the union tried to stop him. They like showed up on set one day, according to Rustam, and they're like, you can't do this. Like it's not a union project. And like, it wasn't set up through the union projects. And he's like, well, I'm going to do it anyway. I'm helping my buddy out. They were like, well, that's not part of the union. And said Robert Carmichael like tore up his union card right in front of him and threw it on the ground. And was like, well, wow, fuck you. I won't be a part of the union. I'm gonna help my friend out with his movie. And said he later got reinstated into the union because he was a pretty popular cameraman, so
Yeah.
they couldn't do it. But yeah, when Hooper was gone, like he was also a part of that, like filming and stuff. And yeah, like you said, June, like she was disappointed she didn't get to work with Hooper. That was like part of the reason she signed up.
So while we're talking about the filming of this movie, there are a couple of other key people that I think we just need to mention. The first is makeup artist Craig Reardon, or at least credited makeup artist Craig Reardon. Apparently, he is mostly just there in credit only. Did you listen to his commentary on the Arrow Blu-ray, Gary?
Sure did. Yeah.
He likes to talk. He's an entertaining.
He has so many stories.
Guy.
He seems like he'd be a great interview because he just
he really
has
does.
like in-depth analysis about everything about a film.
So apparently they had hired another guy to do the makeup on this movie, and they didn't like the work that this guy was doing. So they hired Craig Reardon. Craig Reardon shows up in the set, and the other guy's like, I'm not leaving. So the other guy, who I don't think they ever name him in that interview or in that commentary, but he apparently did most of the actual work on the film. I think the only thing that Craig Reardon says that he really did was one time this other guy was out to lunch and they needed somebody to put makeup on Janice Blythe's boobs for her scene with Robert Englund.
Well, he describes that, but he also talks about what's her face? Carolyn Jones. Like he says, he admits like her makeup on her face. He was like, I know that she looks odd, but that was like instructed, like piling it on. I feel like I've seen some stuff with him that like
they used mortician's wax, I think, on her, which mortician's wax is usually just used for like in little bits, like do like a phony nose or whatever. And for some reason they decided to cake it all on Carolyn Jones. So, and that makeup effect is pretty bad, but I think it's kind of, I guess it was intentional. Like he was instructed to do that. So I don't know. It's weird, but because why hire Carolyn Jones if you're going to hide her under that makeup? But
completely hide her face. Yeah. Like people want.
Yeah, I know. Like, yeah. I mean, Carolyn Jones is, I mean, like I said, she wasn't very old at this time. She was in her late 40s and she was still a beautiful woman, but they made her look like a fucking ghoul in this movie.
Well, maybe it's because the life that she had led sort of sucked her dry of her life force. So she
she definitely looks like she's
old and cracked like a husk. Like there's not much.
She looks like a member of the Sawyer family from Texas Chainsaw, and she's just wearing someone else's face. That's what she looks like.
Yeah,
that's.
But I wanted to mention.
I could have come up with.
I wanted to mention Craig Reardon because this was Reardon's first film as a credited makeup effects artist. But that's notable to mention because this guy, he would work on some pretty legendary productions. He worked on Altered States. He worked on The Twilight Zone, the movie. He later on in his career, like he did the remake of 13 Ghosts, like he did, which has some really, I don't really care for that movie. It's got some really great makeup effects.
No. The effects in that movie are fantastic.
Yeah. And he would also collaborate with Hooper again on the Funhouse and on Poltergeist.
He respects like Hollywood history too. The one thing I appreciate about it, like we're kind of picking on him about like how much he loves to talk and stuff, but it's like clear he's like a nerd, like us. Character. Yeah. Like he's just a nerd, like we are about. Like he cares about like the studio this takes place in, like Raleigh Studio. Talking about it was producer studio before, and it was like John Ford was like filming or like, was there, and
a lot of Corman movies, those Edgar
a lot of
Allan
Corman
Poe
movies, like all of his Edgar Allan Poe movies were filmed there. And so like he obviously like,
and he's pretty young around this time, like 22, 23, I think when he made this movie. But he would go on to create like the makeup effects for Sloth in the Goonies. Like that was Craig Reardon. He created all of the makeup effects for like the villains in Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy. And then he also did some notable work on TV series. He did a few episodes of The X-Files, a few episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and most notably, he did quite a few episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
I have a kind of a love-hate thing for Deep Space Nine. I love it because it is part of the Star Trek canon, but it's to me, it's not as exciting as the rest of the different series. But I will say that a lot of the
says the guy who's currently covering Enterprise on his podcast.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is that the prosthetic work on those later shows, like Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise, are just phenomenal. And I'm sure, this guy had quite a big hand. Craig Reardon had a big hand in that.
He talks about like even with like the death of what's his face, William Finley. Just the idea that was it William Finley or was it Farrar? I think who got the scythe through the neck? That was Farrar.
Yeah, that's Farrar.
Yeah. William Finley got stabbed in the chest.
Yeah, he was talking about how much of a trooper like Farrar was with just like, he was like, no, like Cooper wanted that scythe goes through his neck. Like, we got to make this work. And so they put like 5 pounds of wax in his neck with like a slit for the scythe. So the scythe is like going through his neck. He was like, he had to limbo to set. And then, like it was just, he was like, he was such a trooper, just taking that. Like he wanted the scythe to be actually going through this guy's neck.
Oh, wow.
So another guy that I want to mention is Robert Matty. He's the guy responsible for the crocodile special effect. So regardless of what you think of the crocodile effect in this, Robert Matty is a guy we got to talk about. Unlike Reardon, this was not an entry-level movie for Matty. He'd been working in the industry since the 1950s when he'd worked on the special effects for Disney films like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, The Absent-Minded Professor, Mary Poppins. He was also one of the designers of the Disneyland Jungle Cruise ride. Like, this guy was a veteran. His film prior to Eaten Alive, like his film that he did just before Eaten Alive, was with Tobe Hooper's future boss, a gentleman named Steven Spielberg, on a little movie called Jaws, where he helped to create the shark, and which is how he got this job. Although turns out they had a lot less money than Universal to create this this alligator. And his final film was as a special effects supervisor before his retirement came, which was just his film just after Eaten Alive in 1978, and it was Jaws 2. Wow. But the alligator in this, I mean, it's pretty low tech. I mean, Hooper describes it as like those little duck toys where like the little feet flop around, like when you roll it, that was the extent of the effects in this. And it was a whole alligator. It was covered in, foam latex or whatever. It could barely move. And so you'd have to have a guy just off screen, like just kind of shaking it and stuff. One time somebody accidentally left the thing in the tank overnight, and this foam latex absorbed all of the water, and the thing was like 5 times its normal size. But that, much like the shark in Jaws, the alligator in this movie, or the Nile crocodile, according to a judge, did not work like it was supposed to.
It looked like, to me, there was one that was just shy of like an inflated balloon. Then there was one for like the close-ups and the texture on the back of it.
I think some of those shots are an actual alligator. Some of the
really?
Shots.
Okay. And then
there are shots of actual alligators or crocodiles that they use. Like they went to Mardi Rustam describes like they went to a zoo and like they were like, we want to do what Jaws did. We want to get some actual footage of the thing. And so we went to the zoo and they were like, they just like crocodiles and alligators and stuff just kind of sit there. Like they don't really do anything.
Yeah.
He was just, they're kind of just like blobs, like just hang out. And he's like, and then the guy is like telling us like, well, you got to throw some pork or some meat or something in there. And then
dogs and cats
go for that. Dogs and cats. And he's like, so finally we come back and he's like, I got some meat. So like, we'll throw some meat in there. And he's like, so we got a few of those where they're like, so there's some times it cuts in and it is an actual crocodile, like going after the meat. But he was like, for the most part, they're just kind of chill, like all the time. Like it's not until they're just like hungry. They only feed every so often. And they're just like, now's the time we're going to kill something. He's like, you got to time that perfectly.
When it's crawling under the house after the little girl, it looks like someone just sort of put stuff on their arm and just like,
it doesn't even look like that. It looks like somebody just pushed it.
Yeah.
Just pushed the puppet.
Well, to hear like William Finley talk about it, he was just like, man, he was like so into it, but he was just like, I don't know. He's just like describing it as like, I'm doing all the work there. The croc going through the fence and getting me, like that whole scene took years. They tried pushing it and rolling it. They finally got the mouth open, which took forever. And then he's like, I just kind of pushed myself into the mouth. And it was just like,
it's like Bela Lugosi in the Ed Wood movie, like fighting the octopus, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
So despite leaving the film, Hooper did maintain good relationships with his actors. As we mentioned, he would go on to work with England again several more times. And the film was still released with his name on it in 1976, but it didn't really do much. It quickly disappeared from theaters, only to be re-released again and again under various titles. It didn't make any money under any of the titles, regardless of how many times it was retitled and re-released. And the film never really caught on with audiences or critics. Even modern critics are kind of divided on it. It's not like the case of some of these films we talk about where people look back on it and have reevaluated it. That's not exactly the case with Eaten Alive. Some see it as, they still see it as kind of a sophomore slump for Tobe Hooper, while others see it as a fittingly nightmarish follow-up to Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But I am curious what Gary was able to find in his research on some modern day internet critics.
Oh man, well, you know, somebody went on Amazon Prime and watched this movie for free, and they got
to bitch about it on the internet.
They got real unhappy that they saw it, and as per usual, somebody needs a nap. Richard Jensen here says, "What?"
I was just gonna say, hey, let's be gentle. It sounds like these might be my people.
No, I'm gonna assume Todd is all of these people.
If you send them to me, should I just?
I was just literally sitting here. I was like, I should have sent them to Todd. Like he could just read them. Even like, for instance, Richard Jensen here says, even for a Prime free movie, your time is not free. And this pathetic offering is a horror movie, only insofar as it is horribly made. Horrible acting, horrible scenes. Early on, a girl is supposed to walk right down the road to the Starlight Motel, but the next scene has her wandering around barefoot in the woods. She just happens to stumble upon the Starlight. She then claims to have gotten lost. Did I mention horrible acting? It's on full display here. How do you get lost walking down the road and end up in the deep woods? And how do you then just happen to stumble upon the Starlight? Horrible storyline. I could go on and on. Every aspect of the film is pathetic. For the record, though, Richard Jensen seems to have only watched the first 10 minutes of the movie. There's etc. being too many instances to mention, and there's etc. I can't think of anything else, so I'll just say etc. Let's see here. This is from Who'd Have Thought It? The lost Tobe Hooper film. Whoever rediscovered this should be flogged. It's not even classy trash like Hooper's old Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I can forgive a lot of low-budget B flick, but this pointless film doesn't even register on the watchability scale. The trailer for this film tries to cash in on the success of Jaws by comparing this slop to it. This is how I would write the script for the trailer of Eaten Alive. Endure an agonizingly slow 89 minutes of Judd mumbling incoherently and mostly unintelligible in his ramblings. Watch in ambivalent indifference, scene after scene, that has neither a foundation nor leads anywhere. Experience the monotony of 32 scenes of a little girl crawling in circles over and over underneath a porch. This DVD should be on clearance. And even then, it wouldn't be considered a bargain unless you had a 75% off coupon. Even if you like cheesy but classy B-flicks, stay away from this completely inane film that will make you want to reach for the eject button long before the halfway point. And then one more, I've got Speechless saying absolute garbage. The reason this movie has 20 alternate titles is because Tobe Hooper and the film's distributors wanted to combat the terrible word of mouth that would inevitably arise once the film was shown to unsuspecting audiences. That's how bad this movie is. Even its creators were ashamed of it. Don't ask me what Tobe Hooper was thinking with this movie. One of these days, I'll track him down and I'll ask him about it. Probably not. Hey, Tobe, Why did you think we wanted to see a movie with Robert Englund as a sodomy-obsessed nutcase in a filthy, rundown hotel with an obvious psychopath for the proprietor and a random fake-looking alligator? Maybe Hooper was drunk on the success of Texas Chainsaw. Maybe he was just drunk. I don't know. But this seriously has to be one of the worst, most unbearable films of all time. In Texas Chainsaw, you could sort of believe what was going on. Here we have what is probably the worst, least inviting hotel on the planet, but somehow people keep showing up and checking in. Are you people crazy? Just freaking look at that place. And look at the crazy guy with the scythe who runs it. And look at the giant alligator in the disease swamp out front. Gee, honey, this place looks nice. For some reason, the sky is red throughout almost the entire film. Is this on Mars? That's the last one I got.
Todd.
Yes.
Thoughts?
Okay.
Because I was watching you while Gary was reading that. You were like nodding in agreement pretty much the entire time.
Yes. I wrote all these reviews. Yes. Gary happened to pick every one of my reviews.
Because again, this is a discussion I had with my wife. Was like, I really don't want to be the Debbie Downer here. I will,
but
say,
I'm going to. But I'm going to anyway.
Buckle up, folks. Here we go. I think I enjoyed, or I appreciated the more flushed out characters. I feel more flushed out characters of this as opposed to Chainsaw. I hear you that he wanted it to feel otherworldly, and that may have come across with the not subtle at all red light shining on the place for a good portion of the film. But the fact that he went the route of studio as opposed to an actual location made, again, because I didn't know any of the background for that, it felt cheaper to me. Even though they had 10 times the budget, it felt cheaper.
It's weird. So it's like way more claustrophobic, which I feel like could sort of be the idea.
Yeah. And I think
Texas Chainsaw was like actually in Texas, like open and just
right.
broad.
It felt it cheapened it a little bit. I think there's probably a different way to do it. Clearly Tobe Hooper is somebody with a vision, and with a method to his madness. I just question how well he conveys that to the audience, because the fact that it was like the solar flare thing, I found that really fascinating. I didn't get that from watching the movie.
Yeah, but to me, I don't think you necessarily need to have that information. Like, I feel, and I'm not going to pretend like this movie entirely works. I will say it off the bat. I think that there are aspects of this movie that work well, which I'll get into, and other aspects that don't. I think the thing that Tobe Hooper does so well in this and does so well in Texas Chainsaw is that he creates, like I mentioned before, this feeling of being in a waking nightmare. I think the staginess of the setting adds to that. I think the lighting adds to that. The visual style, I think the sound adds to that. And it's not as successful here, I don't think, as it is in Texas Chainsaw. But there are some weird little bits that make this feel like truly unique. Although you also have to wonder, since Hooper left this film early, how much of that is his doing. Like, are the film's wild tonal shifts intentional, or are they the result of multiple filmmakers having their hands on the film?
Yeah.
You know, because the film does kind of veer into some comedic stuff and then some very, very dark shit. Like the opening with Buck is very, very dark. Yeah. I mean, I love the opening line, the Buck is raring to fuck, but that scene is very hard to watch. And that's the first scene in the movie. And we know that's not one that Hooper directed. We know that Mardi Rustam directed that scene.
He's ready to rape that girl. Like he's
yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah.
And granted, he is not exactly portrayed in a great light later or anything. So he gets his comeuppance. It's sort of like they almost try to turn him into a hero for a minute. Then he immediately just gets eaten by a fucking crocodile. So he's kind of a shitty guy the whole movie. So it's not as if it's problematic in that way. But yeah, he's the film starts with an incredibly mean-spirited scene that was not Tobe Hooper's, but Tobe Hooper does get mean-spirited sometimes.
He does, but he also has this like this side of him that seems to be like kind of goofy or like poking fun at things. Like for instance, like the bar scene. Like where there's that slap fight between the two guys. Like, what the fuck was he?
The guy in the cowboy hat. By the way, the guy in the cowboy hat in that scene is Kit Carson's brother.
Okay. Well, they like literally like slap each other in the face, and then it just amounts to nothing. Yeah. And it's like Buck is almost like knowing that the first scene is not directed by Tobe Hooper. Buck is pretty ineffectual otherwise. Like he's just a horn dog. Like he's you know, that's the most is malevolent the right word? Like just evil that Buck is at the beginning. Like where he's
mostly just a goober and a redneck later on.
Right. He's just kind of a goob. Yeah. Like it just I don't know. So like you can tell that those are sort of two different things. Now, I'll jump in and say that Todd, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I loved this movie the first time I saw it either. I'm not gonna act like I thought it was fantastic.
It's not some lost masterpiece.
Yeah, the benefit I have with Todd being here, I think sometimes is that I feel, I don't know why, but having Todd be here and like be the surrogate, I feel more inclined to like research and just delve into it. I did fall in love with this movie. Like I did, but I've seen this movie over the past week multiple times. Like I've seen it once legit, once with the commentary, like with criticism, like with interviews and stuff, and like delving into the minds of the people behind it. Like something about that sort of made me appreciate what this is. And so I have to say that like on one hand, you have to appreciate like how much somebody put into it or what they were thinking or what they were going for at the time and like really understanding the artist. On the other hand, you have to take a movie and be like, if you were just like walking in on a Friday night and this is the movie you picked, would you be into this movie? I don't know that this movie would have been that. Like it is. No, I will say everybody involved, I think, seemed to understand that they were making a grindhouse movie. Like, I don't think there were any
including Tobe Hooper.
There. Yeah, even Tobe Hooper. So I don't think there were misconceptions there. I think they were going for like just they
wanted to make something that would be a fun night at the drive-in.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, I guess on that point, yeah, it works, but would it have been standout? I don't know. I still don't know that it would have been standout.
I mean, if Tobe Hooper had made this movie first, if this had been like his first movie and not Texas Chainsaw, would we still be talking about Tobe Hooper? Probably not.
Right.
Because while I do feel like there are elements of this movie that feel very Tobe Hooper-esque, if you have watched his later movies, there's a lot to be desired in this depiction. Like, there are definitely moments, like if you've seen some later Hooper movies, especially like I think Texas Chainsaw 2, you can definitely see notes of that film style here. You've got characters like Buck and Judd that feel like Tobe Hooper characters, these like outsized Texans, you know, that feel like or something that you see throughout his filmography. And Neville Brand's Judd doesn't feel like a far cry from Leatherface, only he's got a scythe instead of a chainsaw. He almost feels like a lost member of the Sawyer family. Like he feels like the one that, because he feels like a combination of like Leatherface and the Hitchhiker almost, like, you know?
Yeah.
And like he's the one who left home and ended up opening a motel down the road.
He's the successful one of the family. Yeah.
And maybe Marilyn Burns, after she got away from Leatherface, she changed her identity. That's why she's wearing a wig. And
there you go.
This. I'm creating my own backstory to this, by the way.
Honestly, I was just sitting here thinking, I was like, did you read something I didn't read? Like, because that
no.
That makes sense. Like, I could buy that. All
and
right.
This is what we're recording right now is the start of Justin's fan fiction career. This is going to be him just going off and telling stories between the stories.
Yeah, Sally just like fucking put on a wig and she got away.
She's in hiding. She's in like, it's like what is it called? Witness protection. vacation.
Yep.
Right. She's like hanging
got
out at this
married and had a
hotel in Louisiana, just like right down the road.
And it's run by Judd Sawyer, the member of the Sawyer family. I don't think they're even called the Sawyer family until Texas Chainsaw 2, but that's what I keep referring to them as. But Neville Brand in particular, I think of this is super fun to watch. Like, he is insane. And I don't know how much of it is performance and how much of it is just Neville Brand being actually insane, but he's all like lanky, like limbs flailing everywhere and these incoherent ramblings. And he's a really interesting character, I think, a really interesting guy to watch. And Tobe Hooper puts these little moments in where, well, like one that always stands out is the one where he's in his room alone, like listening to music or singing, and he's going through these and trying on like eyeglasses. He's trying on glasses, which are probably glasses that he's taken from people that he's killed, but he's not like really reveling in them as souvenirs. He's just kind of bored because he lives out in a swamp by himself in a motel that on this particular night has seen like 5 people check into, and that's probably his busiest night in the last year.
Yeah.
But he
that's because
also
they read the Yelp review.
Well, and and last we talked about how Leatherface seems to be like, what the fuck are these people like just coming into my house, like,
right,
and killing them because of that? Whereas Brand doesn't even have that because it's a motel, like people are supposed to come here, but he just can't help himself, and he gets in like this murderous rampage for seemingly no reason other than the fact that he's just a crazy person. And there are some mutterings about him possibly being like impotent, so there's a more of a sexual element to this than Chainsaw, which had no sexual element at all. Like Marilyn Burns was not seen as a sexual object by anyone in the Sawyer family in that movie. She was just meat, right. Whereas in this one, Judd does have a little bit of like a frustration with being supposedly impotent.
There is not one thing in this film, Justin, that is not real about Judd. Like every story you hear, every woman,
Neville Brand.
Neville Brand. Every female on the set of this movie talks about being frightened by Neville Brand. Like they were
terrifying.
That he went into legit lunatic rage and was swinging at them. Kyle Richards, as the little girl, she literally said, quote, "I wasn't acting. I had never seen a man like that, and I felt like he was going to kill me. I don't know what my mother was thinking. I will never get over the image of him with the scythe."
Yeah.
Like she says,
he's a scary dude.
Yeah. Like her mom finally stepped in on the part where they wanted her to be on the dock with the live rats. And like, she was like, "Mom, I can't be under here with the live rats." And like, the mom was like, "No, we're not doing the live rats."
I think they got a makeup girl or something.
They got the makeup girl to be under that, under the dock.
Which they did something similar in Texas Chainsaw, which we didn't touch on last week. But there's a scene where Marilyn Burns' character, where Sally jumps out of a window, and she didn't want to do that, understandably. So they got the makeup girl to put on a blonde wig, and that's what you can tell it's someone in a wig in that. It's not a stunt person, though. It's just the makeup girl who was willing to jump through a window from like a second story. So there's a history of makeup girls just on Tobe Hooper movies, just doing some weird stunt work.
Say what you will. I mean, Kyle Richards, like when you hear her talk about it, she's just like, nobody, it wasn't like cut and everybody was cool. Everybody was method. Like she was like
a creepy set to be on.
Yeah, she was like, it was super weird. She was like, it almost made me not want to act anymore. Like I had only ever seen friendly people on like sets of things. She's like, she says about Neville Brand, like he gave me nightmares for a long time. It was solemn and just everything you see about him. Imagine being chased by this guy. Like she says, it was legit. She said, like on Halloween, like somebody asked her in the interview, they're like, "What about Halloween?" And she was like, "That was like playing." She was like, "There were other kids on set. Like Jamie Lee Curtis was the sweetest person." Yes. She was like, "I played cards with Michael Myers." She was like, "This movie felt like a nightmare every single day."
Well, and the thing is, there aren't any like likable people in this story, really. That's the thing, is like you say everyone's method, but everyone's method in playing kind of an unlikable character, like every single person. I mean, you have like some characters are a little more sympathetic, like Ferrer and his daughter, the actress name escapes me, who's come with him, like they're a little more sympathetic, but they're never quite likable. Like he's still pretty rude and she's kind of cold, but there are elements of this movie that work, and there's elements of this movie that don't work. I don't think it's edited particularly well. Like we talked about how strong the editing was in Texas Chainsaw, but again, Hooper, by the time this was being edited, he's not involved.
Yeah,
he's not involved, so he didn't have any say in that, And I do think that the sound, that industrial sound design, works incredibly well in this. I love if you want to call it the score or whatever you want to call it, but the sound design of this movie, I think, is really outstanding. The film's visual style feels like nothing else out there, honestly. I mean, whether you think the staginess of the setting works or not, it's unique. It doesn't feel like anything else. And the thing is, it's hard to discuss this movie without immediately comparing it to Texas Chainsaw, because this is his follow-up. This is the movie he made right after that. Yeah. This is everyone who saw this movie and they saw the trailer, which the trailer prominently says, from Tobe Hooper, who brought you the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Everyone's going to be comparing this to that movie, and it just can't stand up to that. It honestly just can't. I mean, and it's almost like Hooper was intentionally trying to do as much different in this as he could. Like, oh, Texas Chainsaw is all on location. This one's all on a set. Texas Chainsaw is all almost entirely in daylight. This movie is entirely set at twilight. And Texas Chainsaw was bloodless. This movie's not. This movie's got a guy getting a scythe through his neck.
Yeah.
The things that you could compare, I would say, are that like there is clearly a connection in that he does seem to care about who his killers are. Like I mean, as far as like you spend,
they're definitely
some time with Judd,
fully realized characters.
Yeah, like and that's something like I mentioned before that was mentioned earlier. It's that part of the deal with Hooper and Henkel is like expounding on the character of Judd. Like it could have been just a Killer Croc movie if they wanted Judd to be like a character. They wanted like more depth to
the
that
Croc.
Character.
Honestly, only kills like one person.
Yeah, I mean it gets Judd and it gets Finley, I think.
Well, I think the only person.
And
well, Finley had been stabbed with a pitchfork already.
Yeah.
So most people are either dead or on their way out. Buck gets eaten. I think he's the only one that actually gets eaten alive.
He's like alive and he's like swimming and trying to grab.
He's
onto
the only one that
and,
actually gets eaten alive. Just like there's not really much of a chainsaw massacre in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Right.
Only Franklin gets killed by the chainsaw.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's weird. I mean, they call it that, but no, you're 100% right. I mean, I just think there is this aspect of trying to understand the killer that that like he obviously cares about. But like you said, I mean, by the time this movie is finished, it's clearly not what he intended. I found
not entirely.
Yeah, and I found this one thing from Tobe Hooper, like he said, I accepted this early on. I was making a grindhouse film. This is way after. This is like one of his later interviews. He says, but this is a unique collection of madness, a slice of something I don't think that you can get anywhere else. This thing isn't like most cult films. It's as crazy as the process making it was. I'm happy for it. I'm happy that it's out there.
Yeah, I love that on the Arrow Blu-ray. There's a little introduction by Hooper that you can watch before the film, and he just says like, "I hope you enjoy the colors."
no, he is. He's that way. Like Finley talks about like we made a friendship. He was like, but this is just Toby. Like he just disappears. Like at the time of the Arrow Blu-ray, like he was like I was hitting up Toby, like trying to reach him about like, are you doing the commentary thing for this movie?
Nobody could find him.
He was like, he wouldn't answer. Like he just would not respond. He's like, I couldn't even find like his for certain address. Like he's like, Toby just kind of was like out. Like it just,
wow.
I don't know.
So
Toby just seemed like, later on, like in his interviews that you can find about it, it's just kind of like, I'm glad it's out there. Like, you know,
not super.
It was wild.
enthusiastic.
Here it is.
Well, the
But,
movie
you know, I got
is-
nothing else for you.
It's like violent enough, and by today's standards, and I feel like even standards of horror movies that will come later in the 80s, it doesn't seem that gory and stuff, you know. But there was enough fake blood and Caro syrup covering people in this movie, and enough gore that it actually landed on the UK's video nasty list. Even after cuts were made to appease the censory board.
Wow.
It wasn't actually released uncut by the British Board of Film Classification until 2000, which was 23 years after its release. And that was only a year after Texas Chainsaw had been released uncut in the UK. While the film is violent, I mean, there are obviously worse offenders over the years. And I have to wonder if there was more than just the gore that affected the BBFC's decision on that. You know, like I have to feel like if this feeling of discomfort brought on by the sound design and the visuals, this like nauseating, seasick feeling that you get from that stuff. Like imagine watching this on the big screen with a really loud sound system. Like that would be incredibly disorienting, which is exactly what Hooper was going for. And I have to wonder if that informed their decision to put this on the video nasties list, because it's really not, I mean, it's gory, but it's not that gory. It's really,
I swear to
pretty
God,
tame.
like, I mean, this is going to be the testament to like Tobe Hooper, like all the way, like maybe, I don't know, at least early on, is that he's going for like a surreal, like experience. That's what he's going for. He's not like going for like a straightforward narrative. He's going for like driving you into like feeling something, like just the emotional aspect of it. That's what he's concerned with. And his most successful might always, I don't know, we're going to see as we go on, but like his most successful might be the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because it's just the one that lasted. I mean, like even here, we can rip apart all day the narrative of the story and like the weirdness of it, but it obviously impacted somebody somewhere that they put it on the video nasties, and there's and there's not this so much stuff. It's like constantly when Texas Chainsaw was out, even Joe Bob, like in his reporting on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, had this. He was like, there was not one article you could read about the Texas Chainsaw that didn't misconstrue something that happened actually in the movie. Like it was just like they all saw something that didn't happen. Like it was just like he obviously at least impacted you in such a way that you think you saw or heard or felt something that you didn't actually see. Like that was like part of his goal. So he was successful in that way, and I think he was going for that again here. Like there were these things he was just like trying to make you internalize, like some kind of something to connect you with this film that wasn't like I'm just watching a movie, but like
it's more psychological almost.
Right.
I mean, so much like Texas Chainsaw, I think Eaten Alive has this notion of, and this kind of goes into what you're saying. There's this notion of there's this insanity, this insane world existing just on the outskirts of normality, right? Like if you stray off the wrong path, if you go to the wrong farmhouse occupied by the wrong family, or you go to the wrong motel run by the wrong dude, you could die. You could just run across a crazy person and you're done. You know, like, and that's a kind of interesting continuation of that theme that this movie has from Texas Chainsaw, even though the movies seem aesthetically so dissimilar.
You know, going back to the sound design, because I was really trying to think of like how I felt by what I was hearing, and the thing that stuck out to me the most, and this, I don't usually grab onto things like this, but the little girl's scream from underneath the house, I don't know if you guys felt about.
She's a great screamer.
It felt like a punch, like that's the only weapon she's got, and you can even kind of see it in her face where she's just like like using that to sort of hit him with something, anything. But yeah, it just really made me feel like that was all that she had, and that was the way that they designed, you know, or structured, or, you know, cut up or adjusted her scream in post, was to make her scream sort of punch and like really hit, you know, who she's screaming at, but also to punch the audience. That's what I got.
So if I could say, Todd, to what you're saying, like William Finley, literally, this is this is an exact quote from William Finley I had aside. He said, Kyle was plunged into madness. Toby got great people, but they were all so different. This girl was in this den of scoundrels. Weird mom, ineffectual dad, madman with a croc. Somehow she did it. She had the most ear-splitting scream. All you had to do is point at her. I don't know that this was part of what Toby saw or why he hired her, but like he said, he goes on to describe it. He's just like, somehow when you pointed at this girl, her scream was perfect. Like it was everything you ever wanted out of like a horror movie scream.
That's awesome. So this is the part of the show where I want to get into some stuff that you might watch as a second part of a double feature with this movie. We call this further viewing. So one that I want to mention personally, there's a few. My mind goes immediately to other Killer Croc movies just because
it feels easy.
Yeah, because there's a Killer Croc in this movie, even though it's not that great of a Killer Croc. But if I'm thinking Killer Croc movies, the first one that I always seem to think of is Greg McLean's Rogue from 2007, the Australian horror movie. Greg McLean's
really
the
good.
guy who did. He's the guy who did Wolf Creek, and he's done some other movies since then. But it's one that a lot of people haven't seen that I think is very, very good. Personally,
yeah, I was going to say I'm not super familiar with that one.
I think it came straight to video in the U.S.
Doesn't it have Chris Hemsworth?
It does have Chris Hemsworth before he came to Hollywood. When he was still working in Australia. It's an earlier film of his.
Wow.
Yep. Yeah. Gary, did you have any further viewings on this one?
Well, I mean, I'm going to be an idiot if I don't say like Lake Placid or something, right?
I mean, you're going to be an idiot either way. So
don't worry, Gary.
Let's get
don't
Lake
worry,
Placid.
Gary. I'll make you seem like less of an idiot. So I think people should go watch Anaconda.
You should. I just saw Anaconda like 3 weeks ago, and it was still fun. Especially seeing Angelina Jolie's dad. What's his name?
John Voight.
John Voight as a Hispanic guy.
I guess that's what he's supposed to be in that movie.
He doesn't pull it off as well as Quick Draw McGraw.
I am John Voight. Hey, Anaconda. I sound like Mr. Miyagi. I've been watching Karate Kid. Sorry.
Gary's bad at accents.
Oh, I've been drinking like I talked about. I'm playing the Neville Brand role. But also, like, I mean, you said Anaconda. I would say Piranha, like something like that. Like if you want to see like some stuff based off of Piranha has the idea of like a monster in the water and I don't Justin, do you know another movie that's like quite like this though, that like the guy's like feeding? I mean, like Lake Placid legitimately, like Betty White is like cool with people eating the people, like, you know, she's like,
I mean, that's what I was trying to think of, other ones set like in a swamp area like this or where somebody's feeding. And I'm sure people can tweet at us and let us know if there's stuff that we just couldn't think of, but I couldn't really think of anything quite like that. I just kept going to other Killer Croc movies in which the alligator is actually more of like the villain and not like a human element. And that made me think of like Alligator from 1980, the Louis Teague movie. Louis Teague, of course, he would later do Cujo. Alligator was written by John Sayles, who is an indie film director. And then Alexander Aja's Crawl from last year, which is another great killer alligator movie.
Yeah, because they're just kind of doing
Crawl
their
is
thing.
awesome. Yeah.
Well, because part of what I was going to say is like, I mean, one of the weird things about this movie, different than like if we compare it to Jaws or Anaconda or whatever, it's like those are like killer creature movies. And yes, those creatures are just doing their natural thing. But this is more about a guy who is also, he's already crazy. And then he's like, the croc in this movie is not, he's just being croc. You know, like it reminds me of the Chris Rock bit where he talks about like Siegfried and Roy, and he was just like, he was like, "Did y'all see that?" He's like, "I kept reading all these articles about like Siegfried and Roy, and they were like, the tiger went crazy and attacked Roy," and I was like, "Nah, man, like the tiger just went tiger."
It's a tiger.
It was crazy when you had it wearing a beanie and like rolling around on a unicycle. That's when it was crazy. Like the tiger just did tiger. You put Roy's face in its mouth. Like that's what the tiger does. And it feels like this movie is kind of like that. Is like, no, the croc's just there, dude. The croc's just hanging around in the pond. He's not hunting what you throw at it.
Yeah, he's not hunting people. It's like you throw Robert Englund into his pond and he's going to eat you.
Yeah,
you throw
he's just doing his thing.
Snoopy in there. You know. Eaten Alive was definitely not the sophomore follow-up to Texas Chainsaw that Hooper had probably hoped it would be. And its legacy, I think, is kind of tainted by the fact that Hooper left the film before it was done, which of course brings into question the true authorship of the film. And it's also not the only film in Hooper's filmography in which the question of authorship is raised, but that's a story for a couple weeks down the line. After Eaten Alive, Hooper was given the opportunity to direct a project that would be what I would think is probably what most people consider his true follow-up to Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And to do so, he had to move to the world of the made-for-television film, or more specifically, the made-for-television miniseries. So next week, that's where we're going to rejoin the story of Tobe Hooper as we discuss his 1979 Stephen King adaptation, Salem's Lot. And yes, it is a miniseries, 2 parts. So I think it runs about a little over 3 hours long if you watch the whole thing. So if you guys want to watch Salem's Lot along with us, you can head to cinemashock.net. We'll have links to everywhere where you can stream it. And you can also, of course, find all of our episodes there. You can find our link to our merch, link to where you can subscribe, all that good stuff. You guys want to tell us where you can be found on the internet?
I am at This Is Gary Horne on all of the things.
I am at Mr. Todd A. Davis on all of the things, and you can find my podcast at Computer Resume on all of the things. The second episode should be up now with Mr. Justin Bishop.
That's
we have a fun conversation.
And Gary's also got another podcast called This Is Pro Wrestling that he never wants to promote on this show, but I'm going to do it for him.
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah, it's at TIPW Show on all of the things also.
Yeah. And you can find Cinema Shock at cinema_shock on Twitter, Instagram. Follow us on Facebook and all that stuff.
Turns out people used to wrestle gators.
Well, yeah, still do.
Or probably still do. Yeah.
Well, until next week.
May the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
Be excellent to each other. Johnny has the keys. Johnny, I'm here. Johnny has the keys.
I like that.
It's a callback.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that'll do that.
Stop on that record.